Hi, Tim here with Pete Chatmon, an American director who is best known for producing and directing various films and TV shows. Chapman's career began in 2001 with the Sundance selection of his NYU thesis film, 3D, starring Kerry Washington. His most notable TV shows were episodes of HBO Max's The Flight Attendant, Insecure, Silicon Valley, Love Life, Netflix's You and Atypical, and ABC's Grey's Anatomy. Through the director, his digital studio, he has directed, shot, and edited content for advertising agencies and Fortune 500 brands. How are you doing today, Pete?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Can we kick off a little bit of a story about yourself and why you became a director?
So, for anyone in anything they do, there's probably a little bit of a moment of kismet or inspiration that propels you onto a path of something that you want to explore. And for me, the long and short of it was I wanted to have a hand in designing worlds. And so initially, that was based in wanting to be an architect. I followed that pursuit a little bit in high school. We had a very introductory course in architecture, but the takeaway for me was that there was too much math involved and I did not want to do it. And then down the hall from that class was a filmmaking class, and I took that and I found everything that all the kind of moving parts that I was looking for, and the creativity was more fulfilling and the math was not required. And I had seen Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. It had come out in 1989, but I didn't see it for several years after because of just how young I was. And there was a moment in that film where one character gets his Air Jordan scuffed by another, and as small as it may be, it was that moment where I first saw something in a film that reflected the world that I knew, the life that I had, and it was a very energizing, inspirational moment and kind of making me think that I could do that. Now I continue to hope that I'm giving moments like that to other folks who are coming up behind me. You never know what will strike a chord.
I like how you identified it to a specific inflection point that set you off in this career path.
It really was, man. And like he was, for many Black filmmakers, like he was always kind of the North Star for what could be possible. And you needed to have that just to have a direction to go. And then over time, your career becomes your own. But having something to be aspirational toward was always important.
I like it. Pete, let's jump into it. What are your top three principles to success?
My top three principles to success are curiosity, discipline, and humility. Now, I'll be honest, that was a somewhat easy question for me because I have a book that just came out on my journey as a director called Transitions, A Director's Journey and Motivational Handbook. And each of the 14 chapters has a keyword. And so they're not all principles. Sometimes they're like things to consider, but I don't put them in any particular order necessarily because it all, how you apply them will depend on your journey, in my opinion. But for me, curiosity is important because you can't be closed minded. You can't be closed off. You can't think that what you know or what you think you know is the right way. You have to know what you don't know. That's a very kind of common adage that does not get appreciated as much as it probably should. But I think if you're curious and you remain curious, you will do well in your chosen field. And you'll also prevent yourself from becoming obsolete. Because I know a lot of folks, like in my world in particular, there was like the pendulum swing from film to video 20 years ago. And there were folks who were just so anti video. And it's like, well, where are you now? Everything we do is video. Discipline, I think, is important because once you've used that curiosity to find what it is that makes your heart flutter, for me, it was finding film and wanting to be a director. I needed to have some discipline to pursue the goal. And that discipline was 4 years of film school. That discipline was 6 years of pounding the pavement to raise $500,000 for my first film. That discipline was 15 years of working independently before finally breaking into television and being able to actually get paid for this thing I've been doing for 2 decades for basically weekends and my own enjoyment. And then lastly, after your curiosity kind of piqued your interest, your discipline hopefully got you there. I think humility is important because you have to remember that you haven't ascended to the Parthenon. You know what I mean? You're just somebody who probably had some good breaks, probably had some persistence and was helped along the way by various people in the community that you work in. But your humility, I think, is important because you can get beside yourself and start thinking you are bigger than you are. And you need to remember that you're not.
All right. These are all really good ones. This is where we turn it up and have some fun and take
All
these
right.
apart, turn them into some practical how to's.
Okay.
So the curiosity I liked because you defined it pretty well as overcoming closed-mindedness. I like that don't know what you don't know. That's one I often reference and keeping that information out of that realm and also staying relevant. How do we turn this into a practical way? Because I feel like some people may even struggle with it and saying, hey, I'm just not a curious person. They're the ones that struggle to come up with those interesting questions. And I'm just
Right.
curious, what's your lens and how do you enable that?
I think, it's funny. It's like, it's those reporter questions, right? It's like, how, why,
Yeah.
what, when, where. Like, for instance, for me, I came up through independent film where you were trying to make a dollar, turn a dollar into $100, right? And so as I started doing more television work, you're doing more green screen and like effects. And I could be overwhelmed by it and reluctant and resistant to it. Or I could say, well, how does this work? Okay, well, why did you do that? And why did that not work? I think that's another big one. Like, what are the mistakes here? And I feel like the more you just apply like a general sense of like interest in what you're doing and what other people you work with are doing, the more you can excel. And I think you've got to have that curiosity about like up and down the supply chain. You know what I mean? Like the best CEOs are typically folks who kind of work their way up through each department. And now by the time they're running the company, they have things evolve over time, but they have an understanding of what each person's job is. And because of that, they can make informed decisions.
I like that, like having the broad view of understanding not just what's in front of you, but what's top, bottom, before, after, and then thinking about the whole picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think
Uh,
so. And it comes from, mentioned like a documentary, and that curiosity is everything, right? Like I've found that by asking questions, sometimes I get questions that I didn't know I had answered. And if we just move through the world thinking we've got it all figured out, we're just missing so many opportunities.
yeah, I've kind of realized that over the years. A lot of times we have our own biases that get in the way, that we
Yeah,
think we know things, but if you can put your own assumptions, whatever you think you know, and get to that zero or assume what you know is wrong,
right,
and then really proactively try to listen and learn, and then drive yourself on that curiosity to ask questions and really get the information. And I think every person you meet is that opportunity to learn from somebody.
right. I agree wholeheartedly.
So I like that. Lay it down, natural curiosity, just have a goal of getting understanding all points of views and ask the reporter questions.
Mhm.
How, what, where, why. Especially why. That's the one thing kids teach you. There's an infinite amount of times you can ask why.
Right. Right. Probing questions.
Discipline. Discipline's one of my top threes. I'd love to hear how you make discipline into a practical how to.
So everything has units. I'm a guy who, I'll work out. I've run 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons. And like, you have these goals that are weeks away, months away, or in terms of one foot after another for a marathon. You just have to look at what are the incremental ways that I prepare for this that can move me toward the goal every day while I'm doing small units. And I think that we often kind of treat it as, oh, that's easier said than done. But I think sometimes you just have to lean into it and do it. When I was raising money for my film, I didn't come from a family that was wealthy. I didn't have a blueprint to $500,000, but I read books about film financing. I read books about business plans. I read autobiographies and biographies from people who had done what I was trying to do in some way, shape, or form. And even the discipline and that curiosity, if I may, trying to get that information and absorb as much as I could, it begat new information that helped me pivot to the next level and find partners that I could work with. And it's just appreciating the simplicity of discipline when it feels like, and the certainty of it as well. I think there's a certainty of it that people might overlook. Like if you do something every day with a commitment to getting better at it, there's no way you're not going to move the chains. And just knowing that some things take longer than others. I think in the conversations you might have with your guests, an issue or a challenge rather is probably that once you get out of school, for a lot of folks, you lose the mile markers of your year. I know that I'd be in school from September until December. I'll have a break. Then it'll be January to April-ish May. I'll have a summer. Like once that goes away and now you're like, I want to be a director, or I want to run this company, or I want to start this company, or I want to move up the ladder. Those things have no milestone and they have no guaranteed timeline. So it's really governed by your discipline. and your ability to kind of commit to the fact that you don't know when it will happen, but if you have discipline, you will get there or somewhere like it.
That's one of the toughest parts is that you have this ambitious goal, but it's hard to see the progress on a daily basis. Sometimes you may feel you're going backwards, and you do, you get the ups and downs,
Right.
but you're still making progress. The ups and downs are part of the journey getting there. If
Yeah.
it's, you got to have that pain and go through it. I like how you referenced making it incremental. So that way you
Hmm.
can sense it that you're making the progress. I'm curious about mindset because I feel
Mm.
like part of discipline is mindset and from the every day is a day, from that
Right.
day you wake up. How do you think about it? How do you think about getting into the mindset or building that
Right.
discipline from the start of the day?
Right. Honestly, I feel like, so maybe now that I'm thinking back to my list, there was an order in these three principles. Because I do think the curiosity, like for me, I read so many biographies before I made my first feature because I wanted to know what other people went through. And the more I read, the more I was like, well, if Sidney Lumet went through this and Spike Lee and Oliver Stone and Martin Scorsese went through a similar version of what I did, why would I not have to go through it? And so that helps me create a mindset of I'm doing this thing day by day. And you mentioned like when you were just kind of talking about discipline and not seeing the results, it's like there's this weird thing where you don't see what you're doing because sometimes you might have a negative a viewpoint on it or you might be discouraged. But, I think about like, if you have like family or kids, like whether it's your own or others, and maybe you don't see them for like 3 days and you come back and you're like, their hair's long or they've gotten taller. Oh, they're crawling. And the parents are like, oh, they are. Like they might
Yeah.
not have noticed it because they're there all the time. And then somebody else is like, oh, I definitely see it. And sometimes that's happening for our own mirror looking at the progress we're making. It's like, oh, I'm on day 10 of this workout. And you're like, oh, I don't know if I can do it. And so your friend comes in from Chicago and they're like, oh, you're looking good. I think in having the information and knowing that lay ahead of you, I think that helps with a positive mindset. Because I don't know how you do it if you wake up every day not thinking it's possible or not having a North Star or not having a plan.
It's like some elements of self-reflection, self-awareness.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
How do you make humility happen?
I guess with all of them, you kind of have to check yourself. But I think what's an example? What makes me think of humility? It's like I might be doing something and I have to remember not everyone knows as much as I do, right? Or maybe I don't know as much as I think I do.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know what I mean? If there's praise, I know that I don't deserve it all, right? And if there is a negative thing about it, I'll take it all. Like particularly if I'm in a position of like, let's say directing something and I'm at the top of the totem pole on it, the praise gets shared, the blame gets absorbed because that's just what it has to be. And I think humility is along your journey as you're headed toward whatever your goals are, you come across the people who aren't. And it's not something that leaves a good taste in your mouth, not something that you want to mirror in your own process. And I think it's like, how can I make the experience for people like me 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago as they interact with me nurturing and as positive as it could be, so I'm not the reason why they decide to stop pursuing a dream. Because a lot of people too, over the long course of making anything happen, like you might decide that it's not for you because you've had 3 failures, quote unquote, whatever a failure is. And sometimes that's the way somebody spoke to you and you're just like, you give up. And maybe you were 2 days from selling a script, but you come across somebody who's not humble and is actually more discouraging than nurturing. So I guess with every interaction, hopefully being able to kind of think what's the best way for me to communicate and what's the best way for everybody to leave this with a positive vibe and something that they can turn into action toward whatever our goal is as a company, as an episode of TV or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's like being open, like element of vulnerability, basically. As you were saying, it reminded myself because I was always young and hard headed and would never admit my mistakes. But now it's the opposite. Like I want people
Uh,
around me to point out the mistakes because that's where I'm going to learn. That's how I'm going to improve. And
right.
that's part of growing up. But yeah, I think that humility is something that you get comfortable with especially when you understand it's you. It makes you more human. It allows others to identify with you better.
Right. And I'll say one more thing about that too. There's what I've learned with this particular job. It's like, I think with any job of any leadership position, the title does not make you a leader. Like being director or president or CEO or VP of engineering. Like having the title does not mean people are going to listen to you, are going to be motivated by you, or respond to you. And it does not prevent them from undermining you, or, you know what I mean? And so I think that like understanding that it's all earned. It's all based off of the energy and the exchange and the way that you lead. That's how you get to whatever goal you want. It's not going to be because you're the smartest, so you have the best plan. It's going to be because you can work with people the best.
It's a really good point. What's the best mistake you've ever made?
Best mistake I've ever made. So I'll try not to be too semantical because I try and, like before I said, I did the air quotes around failure because it's like, well, what is a failure if not an opportunity to learn something? But I would say the best mistake I've ever made. Wow, that's a really good one. And I should have had something kind of in the queue for this, but
I picked up the architecture school earlier.
yeah, I mean, here's one. I was so part of my path, my personal path to getting in the director's chair for TV was observing other directors doing their job. And so what I would do is I would treat it as if I've been hired, but mostly I was there to kind of like watch, see and not be seen. On one particular show, one of the executive producers was very nurturing and also trying to determine if you or me or any director who was in that observing director position might be worth giving a shot at directing that show in a future episode. And so I was doing my work. I was trying to treat it as if I'd been hired and prepping the show as if I was going to direct it the next day. And I didn't complete it because I was like, I'm not hired and I'll watch this work tomorrow and I'll take what I learned tomorrow and apply it to the rest of my prep. And on that first day, I was called up by her to kind of run her through my plan for how I would shoot the day's work. And of course, the schedule had shifted from what I had seen on the schedule on a Friday. It had shifted, and now what was happening on a Monday was different. And so I was basically winging it through a couple scenes of the day, just talking about where I would put the cameras and move the actors and whatnot. And so she called me out on it and gave me about 5 minutes to prepare and get my act together. And told me to come get her when I was ready. And so when I did that, I went through the rest of the day. She kind of poked and prodded at everything that I was presenting, and I remained calm. And I saw that this was like kind of a teachable moment, and she was trying to gauge how I responded to the pressure. And I ended up getting an episode of that show a season later. It was Grey's Anatomy. And so I'll label that the best mistake I've ever made because it gave me the opportunity to self-correct in more ways. On one level, it was, okay, now I can put my mind around this, get my act together, and actually show that I know what I'm talking about a little bit. But there were so many other like decisions, like humility, that had to be applied as I was being kind of tested to see how I would respond under extreme pressure and scrutiny from someone that I admired and that also held the ability of potentially hiring me. And I know coming out of that it was maintaining my cool and not responding to the things that maybe were kind of making me angry that were part and parcel of me getting the job for the following season. That was long-winded, but that's the kind of context.
Yeah, but yeah, I like how you can reflect back and pull out the lessons learned.
Yeah.
So show business is one of the toughest industries to break into. What advice would you give to the next generation trying to get in?
So to the next generation trying to get in, this is not driven by, oh, when I was your age, it was like this. But I will say that the democratization of everything from access to cameras to editing equipment to screenwriting software, like it's never been easier to do this job in the world than it is right now. Like, I don't even know if I would necessarily go to film school right now, because when I went, it was my only way to touch a camera. There was no other way to get my hands on a film camera, and film cameras were all that there were. And so while there's a great beauty in the ease with which that you can just pick up and start doing, I do think there's a potential pitfall in not taking the time to really master the craft, study what came before you, and be very disciplined about finding some way into it that allows you to treat it as something that is an art form. And so with all the access that's out there, trying to construct some kind of game plan so you can learn about it, discipline yourself, explore the various crafts, and really become a complete storyteller. Because at the end of the day, it's beautiful to have so many different people sharing their stories, but being able to harness how to use a camera, how to direct an actor, how to find rhythm and pace in your edit, what music is going to work best for a scene. Like, there's so many different things at play. If we really want to get our voices out there with clarity, we've got to know how to really exploit every part of the craft.
It all comes down to goals and discipline.
Yes.
Hey, Pete, thank you so much for your time today. I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, so for those listening, I want to keep up with you. What are good ways to do that? And you also mentioned that you had a book, so maybe if you can run a little bit about the title again and where to find that as well.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Pete Chatmon. So PeteChatmon. I have a book that just came out that I mentioned. It's called Transitions: A Director's Journey and Motivational Handbook. It's on Amazon, available now. Much like you, I do a podcast called Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon, where I talk to writers, directors, executives, actors, showrunners, just people in the business about storytelling and why we'll always need stories in our lives. And we get into some nitty gritty about the industry and people's different crafts and whatnot, but I like to fashion it as a couple folks around a table drinking beers or coffee or wine or whatever your vice is. You're just kind of listening into a candid chat about what it is that we do.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Pete, for the time today.
Thank you so much.